Chapter 9 of Napoleon I, An Intimate Biography, by Walter Geer. This recording is in the public domain. 9. 1800. Marengo. The day after the coup d'état of 19 Brumaire, the 11 November 1799, the three consuls took up their residence in the Luxembourg. That evening the public buildings and many of the private houses were illuminated. Bonaparte, although sovereign in fact, was not yet in appearance. He considered the feelings of the Republicans; but little by little he began to accustom the people to his reign. Josephine was no longer designated as the "Citizeness Bonaparte," but was called Madame. At the Petit Luxembourg, Napoleon occupied the apartment on the ground floor, on the right as you enter from the Rue Vaugirard. His cabinet was near a private staircase which led to a first floor where Josephine was lodged. After the déjeuner, which was served at 10 o'clock, Bonaparte chatted a few minutes with his aide de camp and then set himself to work. The dinner was served at 5 o'clock. After this the First Consul went to Josephine's apartment, where he received the visit of his ministers, and always with especial pleasure that of the Minister of Foreign Affairs, Talleyrand. At midnight, and sometimes earlier, he gave the signal for retiring, saying brusquely, "Allons nous coucher." At the Luxembourg, Josephine began to receive persons of the Ancien Régime. The title "Madame" still offended many Republicans, who regretted the change from the simplicity of "Citizeness." Napoleon began gradually to do away with the Republican fête, while still preserving some revolutionary memories. He abolished the fête of the 21st January, anniversary of the death of Louis XVI, while keeping as national holidays the 14th of July, the day of the Bastille, and the 1er Vendémiaire, commemorating the founding of the Republic. He allowed his wife to surround herself with members of the old court, but he consented to the marriage of his youngest sister with a soldier of fortune, the son of the innkeeper of Cahors. On the 20th of January, 1800, at the Luxembourg, was celebrated the civil marriage of Caroline Bonaparte with Murat, then only a general of division. The religious ceremony was not performed until 2 years later, on the occasion of the marriage of Louis Bonaparte with Hortense de Beauharnais. Murat, born the 25th of March, 1771, was not 29 years of age at the time of his marriage, while Caroline, born the same day in 1782, was exactly 11 years younger. In the words of Madame Récamier, "Of all the sisters of Napoleon, Caroline was the one who most resembled him. She was not as perfectly beautiful as her sister Pauline, but she strongly possessed the Napoleonic type. She had much intelligence and an imperious will, and the contrast between the somewhat childish grace of her countenance and the decision of her character made her extremely attractive." In the whole French army there was no more striking cavalier than Murat. Young, handsome, full of life, with his brilliant uniforms, on the field of battle or in a review, he attracted the attention of every one. Nevertheless, there was never much sympathy between Napoleon and his great cavalry commander, and he hesitated long before giving him the hand of his sister. But Murat and Caroline had been in love with each other since they first met during the campaign of Italy, and Napoleon's opposition was finally overcome by the solicitations of Josephine, who favored the match. After living for 3 months in the Luxembourg on the 19th February, 1800, the First Consul moved to the Tuileries, which then became once more the official city residence of the ruler of France, and so remained until the destruction of the palace by the Commune 71 years later. The Bourbon kings, after the completion of the magnificent palace at Versailles, had preferred to live there. At 1 o'clock in the afternoon, all Paris was on foot to see the brilliant procession pass from the Luxembourg to the Tuileries. Napoleon, who had been preceded by Josephine, was in a carriage drawn by 6 white horses, and was escorted by 3 regiments commanded by Murat, Lannes, and Bessières. The Carrousel was filled with an immense crowd of people who cried, "Vive le Premier Consul! Vive Bonaparte!" From the gate of the Carrousel to the door of the palace, the way was lined by the new consular guard. Many eyes were struck by the inscription which had not yet been erased at the side of the entrance gate: "Le 10 août 1792, la royauté en France est abolie. Elle ne se relèvera jamais." As soon as the carriage had passed the gates, it stopped, and Bonaparte quickly descended and mounted a horse which was brought to him, while the other consuls, Cambacérès and Lebrun, entered the palace. Taking his position before the Pavillon de l'Horloge, with Murat at his right and Lannes at his left, Bonaparte gave the order for the review to begin. As the battle flags of the three regiments were borne past him, the standards riddled by bullets on many a glorious field of Italy, the First Consul, with an expression of respectful emotion, removed his hat and saluted. At the end of the review he dismounted, and, for the first time, entered the royal palace. It was not 8 years since from the shop of Bourrienne's brother, near the Carrousel, he had watched the mob of Paris surging through the place, and had seen the unfortunate king appear at the window with the red cap of the Revolution on his head. In the Tuileries Napoleon took possession of the suite of Louis XIV on the first floor, while Josephine occupied the rooms of Marie Antoinette below, just the reverse of the arrangement later under the Second Empire. The suite of the First Consul, which faced on the gardens, was known in the time of Louis XIV as the "winter apartment of His Majesty." The cabinet, lighted by only one window, was of medium size. Next to this room was the bureau topographique, or map room, and adjoining was a large bedroom which had been that of the king's, where a lit de parade had been placed. Bourrienne tells us in his Memoirs that Bonaparte rarely slept there, for he had very simple tastes and was not fond of luxury. Pour m'exprimer en termes bourgeois, au Luxembourg, à la Malmaison, et pendant les premiers temps qu'il habita les Tuileries, Bonaparte couchait avec sa femme. Every night he descended by a little stairway to the rooms of Josephine, who lived below him on the ground floor. She had furnished the suite of Marie Antoinette very simply. Adjoining her cabinet de toilette was the apartment of Hortense, consisting of a bedroom and a study. During the winter of 1800, Paris thought only of pleasure. The official world set the example, and the season was very brilliant. The finest balls were those given by Lucien Bonaparte, who, as Minister of the Interior, occupied the magnificent Hôtel Brisac. Besides the official fêtes, there were those of the great bankers of the day, which recalled the traditions of the former fermiers généraux. The persons belonging to the old aristocracy of the Faubourg Saint Germain did not yet mingle in the new society, but they were seen at the theatres, the concerts, and at private dinners. All classes of society entered into the social whirl, and the dance was never so popular. The reopening of the masked balls of the Opéra was the great feature of the Carnival of 1800. For a period of 10 years, the Parisians had been deprived of this entertainment so popular with them. Nothing else was talked of in the capital. But while Paris danced and played, the First Consul was occupied with very serious problems. The military situation of France with regard to the three powers with which she was still at war was such that there was but little chance of peace save through victory. As soon as he was in office, Bonaparte had made pacific overtures to the Allies, and had been so far successful that the Czar Paul had abandoned the coalition. The English government, which hoped soon to reduce the French garrisons in Malta and Egypt, refused to make peace, but it was not dangerous except on the sea. With Austria, it was clear that the campaign must be fought to a finish. At the time that Bonaparte became First Consul, the affairs of France were in a deplorable state. The treasury was empty; the soldiers were ill fed and ill clad; civil war still raged in the Vendée, and the armies of the Republic were demoralized from frequent defeats. During the winter of 1800 the energy and activity of Napoleon were everywhere in evidence. The finances were placed upon a firm basis; the soldiers were armed and equipped; the civil war was crushed out, and the spirit and patriotism of the soldiers were aroused by his proclamations. At the same time he began to collect, drill, and organize in different parts of France various bodies of men, who were later to unite near Lake Geneva and form the Army of Reserve. In the spring of 1800 the military situation was as follows. The remnant of the French army under Massena had been driven out of northern Italy by the superior forces of Malice, and was in the vicinity of Genoa. An invasion of France was threatened along the line of the Riviera. All of Bonaparte's conquests had been lost. In southern Germany, Kray, with 150,000 men, menaced the Rhine, while Moreau, with an army nearly equal, stood on the defensive at Bâle. The French had a great strategic advantage in their possession of Switzerland, which, like a gigantic bastion, projected between the two German armies. Bonaparte's first plan was to reinforce the army of Moreau, which, under his supervision, should cut the Austrian line of communications. This scheme was given up on account of the opposition of Moreau, whom Bonaparte could not afford to offend. At this moment came the news that Massena had been driven into Genoa, where he was being besieged by the superior forces of Malice. Bonaparte immediately altered his plans, and decided to move against the Austrian communications in Italy. Before entering into a description of this campaign, it is necessary to describe briefly the topography of the theatre of operations. Brilliant in its conception, perfect in its execution, the campaign of Marengo is one of the most interesting of all Napoleon's military operations, and well deserves a minute description. Separating Switzerland from Italy is the lofty mountainous range known as the Swiss Alps. Extending south from western Switzerland to within about 30 miles of the sea, and forming the boundary line between France and Italy, are the French Alps. Turning east from this point and approaching the sea, the range is called the Maritime Alps, and still further east, along the shores of the Gulf of Genoa, is known as the Apennines. With the exception of a few passes, this great mountain chain almost encircling northern Italy, forms an insurmountable barrier to military operations. Today magnificent highways cross the Alps, and they are pierced by several tunnels, which bring Turin and Milan within a few hours of France and Switzerland, but in the last year of the 18th century there was not even a wagon track for Napoleon. Snow and ice, glaciers and avalanches made the mountain passes both difficult and dangerous for the passage of troops, and almost impassable for cavalry and artillery. The Austrian army in northern Italy consisted of about 120,000 men under the command of General Malice, an able officer, but too old for active service. The greater part of the army was near Genoa and along the Apennines and the Maritime Alps. The remainder was scattered throughout Piedmont and Lombardy, occupying the fortresses and guarding the passes of the Alps. The army had its base on the Quadrilateral, and its line of communications was by several roads down the valley of the Po. Opposed to the Austrians was the army of Italy, less than 40,000 strong, under the command of Massena, which was now shut up in Genoa. Meanwhile, the army of reserve, the very existence of which was doubted by the Austrians, was being rapidly assembled near Lake Geneva. On the 6th of May Bonaparte left Paris to take charge of the operations. An article in the new Constitution prohibited the First Consul from exercising any military command, so Berthier, the Chief of Staff, was nominally the General-in-Chief of the Army of Reserve. Vast supplies had been collected at Geneva, and every preparation made for the passage of the Alps. Bonaparte proceeded to Geneva, and thence to Lausanne, at which places the greater part of the army was assembled. After receiving the reports of officers who had been sent to examine the several passes of the Alps, he decided to move the greater part of his forces over the pass of the Grand St. Bernard. By taking this route, which was much the shortest, he could reach Milan quicker and gain the great advantage of time. His plan was to lead 35,000 men into Italy by this pass, while two smaller detachments were to cross the Petit St. Bernard and the St. Plon. Turreau's division of the army of Italy, of about 4,000 men, at the same time was to descend from the Mont Cenis and attack the Austrians near Turin. Once in Italy, Bonaparte intended to march on Milan and await the corps of Moncey from the army of the Rhine, which was to march by way of the St. Gothard. From the eastern end of Lake Geneva, the route to Italy passes through Martigny and the little hamlet of St. Pierre, crosses the Grand St. Bernard at an elevation of 8,000 feet, and then descends by the village of St. Remy into the valley of the Aosta, and thence into the plain of Piedmont. A little to the south of the Grand lies the Petit St. Bernard, which also opens into the valley of the Aosta. The St. Gothard is at a considerable distance to the east, and leads more directly to Milan. The supplies which had been collected were distributed at different points along the route, and 4 hospitals were established for the care of the sick and injured. The ammunition and gun carriages were transported on the backs of mules, and the cannon were enclosed within the trunks of trees, hollowed out for that purpose, and dragged across the Alps by the soldiers themselves. On the 15th of May the army began its march. There were about 35,000 men, including 4,000 cavalry and 40 cannon. The 4 corps were commanded by Murat, Victor, Duhem, and Lannes. A 5th corps of 5,000 men under Chabran was to cross by the Petit St. Bernard, Bonaparte sent Berthier forward to receive the divisions on their arrival at St. Remy, while he himself remained at Martigny to supervise the movement. Lannes crossed first. He left St. Pierre at 2 o'clock in the morning in order to avoid the danger of the avalanches, and reached St. Remy the same day. The entire army crossed in 5 days, and on the 20th all 5 corps, including that of Chabran, had arrived safely in the valley of the Aosta. The soldiers were gay and cheerful and filled with enthusiasm. Never had their love and admiration for the Little Corporal been so great. Like the great Hannibal, they had crossed the Alps, and now in the fertile plains of Italy they not only hoped for, but felt confident of victory. But a great difficulty was yet to be met. A short distance down the narrow valley, upon a perpendicular rock, stood the small but formidable Fort Bard. For a moment it seemed probable that this fort would stop the progress of the entire army. But the First Consul, who was still at Martigny on receipt of the news, hurried across the Alps, and with his wonderful precision, soon found a way of overcoming the obstacle. The men and horses were sent around the fort by footpaths, which were soon rendered passable, and on a dark night the soldiers hauled the guns past the fort. The lower valley of the Aosta was defended by a few thousand Austrians, who were attacked by Lannes and driven back from position to position, until they finally took refuge in Turin. On the 27th of May Bonaparte, with the greater part of his army, was at Chivasso, about 4 leagues northeast of the capital. Still incredulous of the existence of the army of reserve, Malice was at Alessandria with a few thousand troops, while the remainder of his army, now reduced to about 100,000 men, was scattered throughout northern Italy. The largest contingent of about 30,000 men was engaged in the siege of Genoa. On the 21st of May, Malice received information of the passage of French troops over the Grand St. Bernard. The following day he learned to a certainty that Bonaparte himself was in Italy with a large army, well equipped with cannon and cavalry. He was not only surprised, but struck with consternation. His line of communications was already threatened, and he did not know which way to turn. Hastily collecting 10,000 men, Malice rushed to Turin, where he was joined by several other detachments, raising his total force to about 16,000 troops. He fully expected to be at once attacked by the French, but such was not Bonaparte's plan. He ordered Lannes to march rapidly down the Po on Pavia, while he himself set out for Milan by way of Novara. After defeating a considerable force which attempted to oppose the passage of the Ticino, Bonaparte entered Milan on the 2nd of June. Here he remained several days to await the arrival of Moncey's corps, which was crossing by the St. Gothard. In the meantime he sent Murat with the cavalry to seize the crossings of the Po at Plasencia, where he had passed the river 4 years before during his first campaign in Italy, just prior to the battle of Lodi. The French were now in possession of all of Piedmont and Lombardy north of the river Po, which they strongly held from Chivasso to Cremona. In this territory they had already seized all the Austrian communications, and captured immense quantities of supplies and ammunition. Malice, who was no longer in doubt as to Bonaparte's intentions, now began to concentrate his forces to break through the net which was rapidly closing around him. He ordered all his available forces to march on Alessandria, and his army was materially increased by the surrender of Genoa on the 4th of June. On the 6th of June, Moncey's corps of 15,000 men reached Milan, and raised the forces under the immediate command of Napoleon to about 60,000 troops. He immediately issued orders for the 3 corps of Lannes, Victor, and Murat, about 32,000 men, to cross the Po a few miles below Pavia, and march to the Stradella Pass. During these movements an Austrian courier was captured, who bore a dispatch from Malice telling of the capture of Genoa and of his plans of operations. After occupying the Stradella Pass, Lannes and Victor received an order from Napoleon to march west towards Montebello, and meet the Austrians coming from Genoa. On the 9th of June, at this place, Lannes, with only 9,000 men, encountered 16,000 Austrians, whom he decisively defeated after a stubborn contest, which was finally decided by the arrival of Victor with 5,000 men. This victory gave Lannes imperishable renown, and won for him the title of Duc de Montebello. The First Consul, who had left Milan the same morning, arrived on the field just at the end of the battle. Being deficient in cavalry and artillery, while Melasse was strong in both, he decided to fall back to a position in front of the Stradella Pass, where his flanks would be well protected, and await the Austrian attack. The following day, Desaix arrived on his return from Egypt, and was given the command of a corps. After waiting 2 days for the Austrians to advance and attack him, Napoleon could bear the suspense no longer, and accordingly decided to advance and seek Melasse. Leaving a force to occupy the fortified camp at Stradella, he marched towards Alessandria. On the 13th of June he crossed the Scrivia and debouched into the plain of Marengo. An observer standing 120 years ago on any one of the moderate hillocks near San Giuliano looking west, would see before him an almost flat plain extending to the river Bormida. This plain was covered with meadows, vineyards, and olive orchards, and was not cut up, as is usually the case in Italy, by canals and ditches. It was an admirable field for cavalry evolutions. About half-way to the Bormida the observer would see the little village of Marengo, past which ran a meandering brook, bordered by marshes with high banks here and there. Just beyond ran the Bormida, which here pursues an irregular course with extensive loops. At a distance of 6 or 7 miles in the background could be seen, through the trees which bordered the river, the walls and towers of Alessandria. Across the plain ran several country roads connecting the villages and farms. Such was the famous battlefield of Marengo, which even to-day is little changed. During the afternoon of the 13th Bonaparte ordered Victor to proceed to Marengo. Here only a small detachment of the Austrians was found, which was quickly driven across the Bormida. From all these indications Napoleon came to the conclusion that the Austrians had abandoned Alessandria, and were attempting to escape by another route. He therefore directed Desaix, with one division of his corps, about 6,000 men, to march on Novi, a short distance south of Marengo, in order to intercept Melasse, if he was endeavoring to escape by this route. It thus happened that on the evening of the 13th of June Napoleon was unprepared for the battle of the following day. Contrary to all his principles, he had scattered his forces in the face of the enemy. He nearly paid dearly for this error. Meanwhile, at Alessandria, all was in confusion. The Austrian communications were severed, and Melasse did not know what course to pursue. He therefore called a council of war, at which 3 plans of action were suggested. First, to cross the Po at Valenza, and march on Pavia. Second, to retire to Genoa, and prepare to stand a siege there, supported by the British fleet. Third, to cross the Bormida, and attack the French in the endeavor to cut their way through. The third plan was adopted. It was decided to cross the river the next morning, and attack the French. The army of Melasse numbered 32,000 men, including 7,000 cavalry, and he had 200 cannon. At daybreak on the morning of the 14th, the Austrians began to cross the river. They at once attacked and drove back the French outposts, and advanced towards Marengo. Victor, who had arrived at Marengo the night before, received the attack of the Austrians, and at first succeeded in driving them back. At about 10 o'clock Lannes arrived on the field with his corps. The French line of battle now numbered about 15,000 men, or less than one half of the Austrian troops. At 10 o'clock Melasse attacked the whole French line, and made a determined effort to gain possession of Marengo. Both sides fought desperately; the Austrians with the energy of despair. All the efforts of the French were unavailing to resist the furious attacks of superior numbers, and both Victor and Lannes were forced to give way. They retired in disorder towards San Giuliano, followed by the victorious Austrians. Such was the critical state of affairs when Napoleon arrived on the field at 11 o'clock. He had already sent orders to Desaix to return, and had them hurried to the front with all the troops he could collect. He brought with him the Consular Guard, the division of Monnier, and 2 regiments of cavalry, making in all about 7,000 men. The struggle was renewed with increased fury, but all the efforts of Napoleon could not now turn the tide of battle in favor of the French. It was not possible to hold out any longer, and he ordered a retreat. The French, almost demoralized, retired behind the hillocks of San Giuliano. They had been driven 3 miles beyond Marengo; the greater part of their cavalry had been destroyed, and more than 2/3 of their cannon had been captured. Melas returned to Alessandria, and sent a dispatch to Vienna announcing his victory. During the day he had shown great energy and courage, but he now felt the effects of his exertions, and the weight of his 70 years bore heavily upon him. He left the army in command of his chief of staff, General Zach. Zach now rearranged his troops for the purpose of pursuing the French, whom he believed to be completely routed. At about 4 o'clock, the Austrian advance began, the troops moving forward in marching order rather than in line of battle. Meanwhile, Napoleon had begun to rally and arrange his troops behind the hillocks near San Giuliano. At about 5 o'clock, Desaix arrived. At the sound of the first cannon shot at Marengo, he had halted his division and turned back. Napoleon at once formed Desaix's division and the French troops about San Giuliano into line of battle. When the advance column of Zach appeared from behind the rising ground in front of the French lines, they were surprised to find the whole French army in position for battle. The French at once attacked with fury, and everywhere overwhelmed the Austrians. 2,000 men were captured, including General Zach himself. Continuing the advance, the French forced the Austrians back to Marengo. Here they attempted to make a stand, but were again defeated, and retired in disorder across the Bormida to Alessandria. By 10 o'clock that night all the Austrians had recrossed the river. Napoleon had won in the afternoon the battle that he had lost in the morning. A great disaster was turned into a great victory. On the following morning, when the French were preparing to cross the Bormida in order to attack the Austrians in Alessandria, Melas sent an officer to the French headquarters to propose terms of surrender. That same day the negotiations were completed, and an armistice was signed. By the terms of surrender, Melas was allowed to evacuate Alessandria with the honors of war, and to proceed to Mantua. In return he agreed to give up the whole of northern Italy as far as the Quadrilateral, and to surrender all the fortresses and the fortified cities. In proportion to the numbers engaged, both the French and Austrian losses were very heavy. Desaix was killed at the beginning of the battle of the afternoon, and his death was deeply regretted by the First Consul and the French nation. At Saint Helena, Napoleon spoke of him as follows: "Of all the generals I ever had under me, Desaix and Kléber possessed the greatest talents, especially Desaix. Kléber loved glory only in as far as it was the means of procuring him riches and pleasures, whereas Desaix loved glory for itself, and despised everything else. To him riches and pleasure were valueless, nor did he give them a moment's thought. He was a little, black looking man, about an inch shorter than I am, always badly dressed, sometimes even ragged, and despising comfort or convenience. When in Egypt I made him a present of a complete field equipage several times, but he always lost it. Wrapped in a cloak, Desaix threw himself under a gun, and slept as contentedly as if he were in a palace. For him, luxury had no charms." Napoleon had begun the passage of the Grand St. Bernard on the 15th of May, and just a month later he received the surrender of the Austrian army in Italy. In 1 month he had crossed the Alps, entered Milan, severed the Austrian communications, fought and won a great battle, and as a result obtained possession of the greater part of northern Italy. Referring to this period of Napoleon's career, Alison, who certainly cannot be accused of any prejudice in his favor, writes as follows: "The sudden resurrection of France when Napoleon assumed the helm, is one of the most extraordinary passages of European history. When he seized the helm in November, 1799, he found the armies defeated and ruined, the frontier invaded both on the sides of Italy and Germany, the arsenals empty, the soldiers in despair, deserting their colors, the royalists revolting against the government, general anarchy in the interior, the treasury empty, the energies of the Republic apparently exhausted. Instantly, as if by enchantment, everything was changed. Order reappeared out of chaos, talent emerged from obscurity, vigor arose out of the elements of weakness. The arsenals were filled, the veterans crowded to their eagles, the conscripts joyfully repaired to the frontier, La Vendée was pacified, the exchequer began to overflow. In little more than 6 months after Napoleon's accession, the Austrians were forced to seek refuge under the cannon of Ulm, Italy was regained, unanimity and enthusiasm prevailed among the people, and the revived energy of the nation was launched into a career of conquest." In his admirable monograph on "The Campaign of Marengo," Sargent says: "At this time Bonaparte was 30 years of age. He was vigorous in mind and body. He was ambitious, and had a massive determination to succeed. He had a will which no obstacle could daunt. With a marvelous intuition he was able at times to foresee just what course his adversaries would take. So accurate was his information, so profound his knowledge of military matters, that he was often able to predict what, under certain conditions, would happen. In short, he was a consummate master of war. The fact that he was a great organizer, a great tactician, and a great strategist, is the real reason why he was so successful in war. Among all other great soldiers of the world, it would be difficult to select a single one who possessed in so marked a degree all these qualities. As an organizer, he was not excelled by either Cæsar or Alexander. As a tactician, he was equal to Marlborough or Frederick. As a strategist, he surpassed every soldier of ancient or of modern times. Take him all in all, he was, perhaps, the foremost soldier of the world." Chapter 9.